Today we'll have each speaker present for 3 to 5 minutes, after which we will take 2 questions from the participants for each speaker. We have 4 speakers for today and we'll follow this for each speaker, after which we'll open the floor for questions and comments.
Great. So let's jump to the first speaker. Sadish Dhakal is a data and policy manager at GBL. He's our colleague. He holds a master's in development economics from the Institute of Social Studies, The Hague. At GBL, he works on maintaining the quality of data and research design. And prior to joining the lab, he worked on several impact evaluations in India and Nepal. Today, he will talk specifically about the differential opportunities in the private sector to conduct M&E. Over to you, Sadish.
Great. Thank you so much, Lavanya. And everybody who's here, thank you for being here. So I'm just going to give a quick introduction to M&E in the private sector. And actually, the idea of evaluation is not that new. We see it a lot in the form of A/B testing. If you think about Amazon or Uber, they're always trying out new things to improve their products. So Amazon might be trying to figure out where to place their ads on your screen to maximize their revenue, or Uber might be trying to see if a new algorithm, a routing algorithm will improve the user's experience, right? So behind the scenes, they will try out these ideas using randomized controlled trials. But that is not quite what we're here to talk about today. That's more about product development and improvement. But what we are here to talk about today is the impact evaluation of development programs in the private sector. And it might in itself be a new idea to a lot of people who have joined in today, because it was to me. So who does development programs in the private sector? And what do they look like, right? So there is actually an increasing awareness of labor rights in developing countries, and there's an increasing awareness amongst consumers about the social responsibility of businesses, right? And the businesses have also started to recognize this. So a lot of times the development programs are catered towards the very bottom line workers who manufacture different products. So these might be programs that help them improve their health. These might be financial literacy programs, or these might be programs catered to the communities of the workers. And these all, provide us the opportunity to do an evaluation. So there are similarities when we're talking about impact evaluation in the private sector and the public sector, and there are differences. I'm going to start with a few differences. So the first difference I would say has to do with the role of brands. So the idea of impact evaluation is to find an idea, accurately measure its impact, so that you can compare this idea and the impact of this idea with the impact of another idea or another program. And by comparing, you get to know which program has the most impact, and you can take this evidence to the governments or to large donor organizations or international development agencies, and they are in the position to scale it up. The governments can even design their policies around the evidence and enforce the policies, right? So these are the organizations who scale it up. But in the private sector, the brands can play that role. And when I say brands, you should think of McDonald's or Coke or Nike or H&M. These are all large organizations which either have their own, a large employee base on their own, or they work with suppliers and businesses worldwide who produce their products. So if we can tell the brands that, okay, in this location, in this factory, we learned this from this development program, we realize that this program is effective and has high impact, they can take up that evidence and endorse it within their own networks and within their own suppliers. And that is how scale up can happen. Now, interestingly, I think the idea of impact evaluation is very new to brands, and they don't really know how to engage with this idea. And that's that's been challenging for us, and that's also been rewarding because now brands are starting to listen, and they're starting to understand what GBL does, and there is more and more possibility of collaboration. So the next difference, I would say, is the potential to study profit, right? So a profit as an outcome. So when we think of impact evaluation in the public sector, it's mostly catered towards social outcomes. But in the private sector, the idea is, at least with GBL, the idea is to convince businesses to take up good ideas. Now, we can allude to the sense of social responsibility, and it is, businesses do want to do good things for their workers. They do want to allow their workers to work in pleasant environments, right? Or they want to give back to the workers and their communities, but it comes at a cost. So when you say that, hey, listen, this program improves the life of your workers and their communities, but it also improves their productivity, or it makes your workers stay with you longer. They don't quit their job, as often. So that, turns into productivity, and that leads to higher profits for the business. So when you introduce profit into the conversation, suddenly the cost benefit calculations become very different, and your goal behind the impact evaluation, how you're measuring impact, it aligns with the business's own goals, and it really makes businesses listen. So this is again why I'm very excited to be working in this sector. So those are the two main differences. Now there are similarities in how monitoring and evaluation happens in the private sector and in the public sector. We cannot get around doing good research, and we really need to have accurate ways of measuring the impact, through accurate data collection and through research design. So that doesn't change. You still need buy-in from stakeholders and partners at all levels. And this is something new I learned, when I came to GBL. I thought, okay, this is going to be working in the private sector. I'm going to be working in the private sector. It will be different from working with bureaucratic governments. But it turns out that, businesses can also be large hierarchical organizations. And oftentimes, it's actually easier to convince top management about what you're trying to do because they have a bird's eye view of their business. But when you start to talk to managers who are responsible for the day-to-day operations, and when you're talking to them and saying, hey, let me come in and randomize things in your workspace, right? That, that is going to interfere with the operations, and that becomes challenging. So you need to create buy-in at all levels still. And the last thing I would say is, there's still the question of doing ethical research, because it does involve human subjects, and there's reasons to be especially careful when you are doing research or doing impact evaluations in the workplace setting. So those are actually all the points I wanted to cover. That was very quick, but that's all I have for you. I will hand it back to Lavanya.
Great. Thanks so much, Sadish. Just to quickly summarize his key points, Sadish spoke a lot about how private sector is increasingly looking at this idea of responsible business. And I personally really like his comparison of how big businesses can be looked at as governments or international development agencies in this space, and hence the scope for M&E. What I also found really interesting was how he underscored the idea that you need buy-in from all stakeholders at all levels, and how, contrary to popular belief, even in the private sector, it may be a bit slow in large organizations. So the floor is now open for questions. We will take 2 questions specifically for Sadish right now. So if you want to ask a question, raise your hand and we will call on you. We have Atma raising his hand. So Atma, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hello guys, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. By the way, first of all, guys, nice to be part of this. So Sadish, I just wanted to ask you, so you said how comparable the private sector and public sector are in terms of like hierarchical organizations and everything. But like, the kind of evaluation that you do in public sector, is it, I mean, there's a bigger scope, right? There are a lot of other actors involved. But do you think it's still the same when it comes to the private sector? Like when you're talking about one company or like two companies, and in the public sector, you're talking about governments and a lot of people involved.
Sure. I'll take that question. Maybe I think Bhavya is also here. I'll take
Yeah,
another question if someone has one, and then I'll
Bhavya
answer both of
is
them
also
together.
raising their hand. So, Bhavya, you can ask a question.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, hi. So just because I've read a lot on, as in the ethical challenges RCTs pose, how do you balance out these ethical considerations while you're conducting your evaluations at GBL? How do you reach that like address that trade-off of, of having to conduct research as smoothly as possible, while also like, especially when it's considering, let's say, a trial of, let's say, giving a subsidy or a service to one particular section of um, to the target group and denying the others for that particular period of time. Doesn't it's at some level affect how these people exist and income on an income level or something like that? Hello?
Yes, sure. I'll try and address that also. Great. So I'll start with Atma's question. The scope, I think, perhaps the actors are different, right? But I think the scope, in a lot of ways, is the same. And I think my colleague Smit might talk about it a little bit. But one of our programs, after we finished our study, we found impact. We took it to a brand, and they said, "This is great. Now we want to take it to 1 million women," right? Or even within, we work with Shahi Exports a lot, and that program, even within Shahi said, "This is great. Let's expand it." And now I think Shahi has taken the program to 30,000 women. So the actors are different, and but that's fine. And 1 million people is still 1 million people, and also it's not really detached from the government, because the government does engage with the private sector a lot, and there is actually a lot of opportunities for the public-private partnerships, and we are trying to pursue some of these, and also like partnerships between the private sector and large donor organizations or international agencies. These are very much possible because I think everybody realizes, the reach of the private sector. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit. Also, in the interest of time, I want to take the other question, which is the question of ethics. And I think, unfortunately, this might be a little bit of a standard answer, but I don't think the question of ethics is, or the challenges with ethical research is that different in the private sector and in the public sector, because you're right. Like, what about denying a program to, when you're randomizing, you're denying something to the control group? Well, the reasoning is that we don't know if it's a good thing, right? So we're trying it out. And again, like there's the question, and even if there's a trade-off, there's a question of learning from the study for the larger good. If you believe that you learn from the study, and if you find impact, you will be able to scale it up and take it to a much bigger population. Maybe that cause is worth the cost. And actually, we shouldn't be deciding that, which is why when we conduct research within GBL, we go through the review boards, ethical review boards, and we only engage in research that are ethically approved. So you have to acknowledge the challenges and yeah, address them. And it gets tricky sometimes, because like when you're talking about medical interventions, you have to be extra careful. So yeah, that's what I have to say about the ethics of it.
Sadish, I hope Atma and Bhavya that Sadish managed to answer your questions. Also, just a quick point for those of you joining us, welcome, and please help yourself to the chat window to kind of catch up on what you've missed. And thanks, Sadish, again. Moving on, since we have limited time, our second speaker is Smit Gade, who is a data and research manager at GBL. Smith holds an MPhil in economics from the University of Oxford. And at GBL, he focuses on research, design, and data-related work. He is also a visiting professor at the Indian School of Business and Finance. And prior to GBL, he was working at JPAL. Today, he will talk about leveraging data systems in factories to conduct monitoring and evaluation. Over to you, Smith.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Mansi. So, one of the important things that Sadish underscored is there are a lot of similarities, because still the methodologies remain the same for a lot of this, but the practical challenges are a bit different. Both, there are something which working in private sector in M&E makes some things easier, but many times it makes some things difficult. So, Mansi, can we move to the next slide? If we, for example, at Good Business Lab, we have done most of the other things that development economics do. So a lot of experiments which we try to do are randomized controlled trials. And that's what we strive to do for. So most of our experiments which we do would fall into those categories, and we actively try to do it. But as Bhavya asked, okay, what are the ethical questions? Apart from ethical questions, there are logistical challenges for doing randomized experiments. So many times randomization is not possible because they're logistically infeasible, as well as then you might not have buy-ins. In such situations, it is good to get, for example, a detailed understanding of the setting you're working in, and then you can go for quasi-experimental approaches. So one of the example that we are trying actively to do is, one of the areas which we are very interested in is how does flexible work arrangement affect workers? Does it allow workers to be more active, more productive, and just make the jobs accessible to much more workers? So for that, what we are trying to do is, one of the factories in Shahi actually moved to a shift where they allowed, instead of being a fixed shift, they allowed 3 shifts where people can come in and choose their shifts. Now, this was a policy change that one factory implemented, but essentially comparing those factories to other factories and using large data over time, we are trying to measure the impact of this factory. So these quasi-experimental approaches essentially can help us get there in M&E approaches for policies, and as well as then kind of leverage the understanding of the first. I think the important point for quasi-experimental approaches is just to, as Sadish mentioned, get buy-in from all the stakeholders. A lot of this research project which we are doing were started when we were talking to factory management, and they told us, oh, we are doing this. And that essentially allowed the conversation to go forward and doing the evaluation. The one major thing I want to talk today about doing lean evaluation using passive data collection in firms. So as a lot of people who have done M&E or are interested in sectors would realize that apart from the intervention cost, the biggest cost for M&E would go into data collection. As if you're going to a rigorous randomized control trial, the most of your budget would go into, say, data collection, and that would be hardest part. But for example, in a private sector, one of the most important thing is you have most of the firms collect data for their own business purposes, right? As well as these data sets are there, depending on which type, how advanced the firm is, those data structures would be developed or less developed depending on their sophistication. But that sets one set of data sets. And the second is businesses don't collect a lot of data set that an M&E for development programs would require. For example, one of the major things which we are looking for a lot of our programs is mental health of the workers. Now, businesses don't usually collect that data. So then in those settings, it is required that you do primary data collection. And I think both of these are some advantage and disadvantage. So can we move to next slide, Nancy? So for example, businesses collect a lot of data, as I said. So some of the data that businesses collect is, for example, if they get an employee in the firm, they would get all their demographic details, for example, their education, their date of birth, and all other details. So this data, for example, if you're doing a survey form, you don't have to collect all this information in firm because you can just access this administrative data. As well as then, if you're specifically operating in a manufacturing settings, then there is production data that is available, daily punch-in data for workers that is available, their salary data is available, as well as lots of other small data set. For example, what they've purchased, what is the share of, if you are in supply chain, what is where the item is being procured, where the item is being shipped, all that data sets are available. Now, the advantage of this is that these data sets cost you zero incremental cost, right? Because firm can just share the data with you. I think that makes it, for example, one point Sadish made, which was important, is studying profits. Now, to study profits, all these data are essential to get the kind of ROI for firms or cost benefit analysis for the firm. So in that setting, I think it becomes important. I think this is one of the very big plus if you work in private sector, to have this rich data set. For example, we work for Shahi Exports, and we have a data set which is like 10-year attendance record of almost 70 to 100,000 people who are working in the firm. So that rich data set provides a lot of new opportunities to do work in this data set. I think one of the hard thing to do is to convince firm to share data with you. I think the data is there, but firms, because this is key to their businesses, would be sensitive. So you need to share, you need to understand the firms, make sure their data systems are enough that you protect their data, as well as you have sufficient legal protection for the firms by signing NDAs and other detail, so that the firm is comfortable enough to share your detail. Having an ethical review board, as Sadish mentioned, help, because that builds credibility and tells businesses that, okay, these people would take care of data as well as the workers which were doing the programs. Can we move to next? Conducting survey data in firms also presents some opportunities. For example, if you have done household surveys before, lot of time, effort is spent in finding households, getting their appointments, their time, and that is where a big cost issue as well as time issue. If you're doing surveys in firms, the workers are easily available to conduct the survey, so they're in the same premise. So that essentially gives you much better access to the survey population and gives you much higher rate of acceptance for surveys from these people. But then also then you can try other approaches, for example, phone-based survey, because you have essentially, because of the firm, you get from admin data access to their phone numbers and then use that. Also, for example, there's some approaches which you're trying is essentially trying to evaluate how good phone-based or IVR-based surveys can work. But still, those are something which we haven't tried for their limitation, but which we are looking forward to do. Similarly, for program implementation time, we have tried to do lot of programs, but then in case we need to provide the firm with the templates for data collection for programmatic data. I think those were the two major points I want to understand.
Perfect. Thanks, Smit, for taking our class as the perfect professor. I think you did a really cool thing, which was taking an important step back and explaining some of the major barriers for private sector to invest in M&E, one being the existence of robust data systems. And I think for those of us who worked at JBL, we all have learned that what a great potential these data systems hold to unravel certain trends and patterns which can inform key decision making. And even the point that you mentioned about quasi-experimental approaches and the need to design it with those on the ground.
So we'll just move to the questions and we'll follow the same drill. If you have a question, raise your hand and I'll call out your name. Mamta is raising her hand. So Mamta, you can ask your question.
Hi, Smith. Thank you for that. My question is, do you have an example of when a brand endorsed an evidence-backed idea? And what's your key recommendation to factories who are just starting to build their data system?
Okay, thanks, Mamta, for the question. Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect. Do we have any other questions? Then perhaps Smith can address both together.
Mamta sneakily asked 2 questions though.
Smith, do you want to address them?
Yeah, so I think I'll start with the second question. For M&E, I think it's most of the out of the purview of the M&E organization to essentially build data system for the firms. I think some of the things that we can do is just to, many times these firms work on strictly trying to reinvent something which is necessary rather than taking long-term approach. And if you're in such situation, it might help to just work with the firm to actually make their data systems better, robust, integrated with each other. For example, if they have different HR system and production system, maybe help them to essentially integrate them so that the systems can speak them with each other in a better way. As well as then, I'll give you an example. For example, in a evaluation which we did, we wanted to get individual level productivity data of workers, but Shahi Export at that time was not collecting that. The production data was in a manufacturing setting. Production happened in a line setting where 40 to 50 workers come together, do their small bits, and at the end, one garment is produced in garment setting, right? So they were measuring just the number of garments produced at the end of the line. So you would get a productivity at combination of 50 people rather than one person, which was needed. So we talked to them, tried to convince them that this would be helpful for the firm. And in that case, they agreed, and then we helped them to build that data structure for them. So this is one example where we had a specific need for intervention to have a specific data system. Then we tried to work with the firm to essentially institutionalize that structure as well as convince firm that this would be helpful for you. The second one, I think for the first question, I think Sadish mentioned Quay's program, which was one where brands try to take the evidence and scale the program. But then I think a lot of people in development as well as in government, for example, a lot of people struggle with scaling up of the evaluation. And then I think this is not as, maybe we feel it's potentially a bit easier in businesses, but still it's a very difficult task to people to take up evidence, and we're still working on it.
Great. Thanks so much, Smith. We'll have time to ask Smith more questions towards the end, but I want to jump on to our third speaker, Laura Quinn, who is a sustainability, partnerships and communications advisor at Shahi Exports. With over 15 years experience across India, the UK and the US, Laura has worked with major corporations and social enterprises to develop impact-driven sustainability and social impact initiatives through successful partnerships. She is a keen advocate for detailed data and smart measurement. Today, she will talk about why M&E is important for India's biggest apparel export house. So over to you, Laura.
Hi, thank you for that introduction, Lavanya, and thanks for the invitation to speak on this webinar today. It's a very kind of, as you know, a very important topic for Shahi, so it's great to be here and talking about it today. I'm not a researcher, nor am I an economist, so I'm going to talk less technically. I'm just going to talk a little bit more about the motivations for a company like Shahi to kind of put the investment and priority in M&E that we actually do. So I just share a bit of context for those who aren't too familiar with Shahi. So we are India's largest garment manufacturer. Probably you knew that already. We have 65 factories, 3 processing mills across 9 states in India. And the big number there is that we have over 100,000 full-time employees. Around, I believe around 70,000 of those are on the factory floor, and around 67% of those are female. So we operate at kind of a really quite huge scale. And if you switch the slide, please, thanks. So what this means in I think Sadish mentioned earlier, that in some cases, when we look at business as a whole, it does operate on the same scale, if not bigger, of governments and multilateral development organizations. And we were at Women Deliver this week, and with Anant, Shahi's head of organizational development. And this number was quoted quite a lot at Women Deliver, that there are 190 million women working in global supply chains, not just apparel, but all global supply chains. So we see that as a huge opportunity to drive development and to have a positive impact on the world through the work that we do. If we go on to the next slide, I think what's really important for a business like ours is it can't just be the right thing to do. It has to be the smart thing to do. And what I mean by that is that we have to think about this as, we are a business, and businesses have to be economically viable, otherwise they can't exist and we can't continue to employ people. So when we think about, the development initiatives that we run as a business, we have to think of those in terms of our belief that employees who are empowered, who are healthy, who are well-skilled, who are confident, are going to be more productive, be able to use their initiative and to contribute to our bottom line ultimately. And that means that when we look at development initiatives within the factory, we look at those as part of a holistic business operation. And we don't look at them as a philanthropic endeavor that may, that is operating separately. We look at them as part of the integrated business. And why that's really important is because we actually review them with the same rigor that we would look at any other business operation that we do. And that means M&E is critically important for us, measuring what the impact of that is, just as we would measure the impact of any other business decision that we made. So when we think about M&E in terms of the development programs that we create, there are 3 lenses, I guess, through which we look at those. And I will talk about these separately, but the first is the social and well-being outcomes, and I'll talk a bit more about why that is, for me, fundamental and probably the primary thing that we need to be looking at. We look at how effective the implementation is, and we look at the business impact. So I'll talk through those 3 one by one. If we go to the next slide. So I think what's really important to remember is, although we're a business, when we are implementing development-based programs within a business setting, we have to remember they are development programs and they are not an academic exercise. They are often rights-based, educational, or involve access to essential services. And these are very human endeavors. And we often work in partnership with NGOs because this is work that businesses are not actually, it's not our skill set. We don't understand the nuances of implementing programs like that, and the ethical considerations and the risks involved. So our first and foremost M&E priority is to ensure that we're actually delivering ethically on the outcomes that we intended. And what we generally do, just like any other development program, we'll have a theory of change for that program that may be a program we've developed or GBL has developed actually, or it may be a program that's come from an NGO, but regardless, we'll be looking at what are the outcomes of that program from a social well-being or welfare perspective, and are we actually delivering on those for the beneficiaries of that program? So that's a really first consideration. If we go on to the next slide, so where it gets more, I think that's base level is number 1. Where it gets a bit more interesting, and I think what we get really excited about, and particularly with our relationship with GBL, is we go one step beyond just going, is this program working? Is it delivering the things it said it was going to work? To start looking at, okay, we're a business, and optimization is what businesses do, right? It's what they're really good at. So we start to look at the efficiency and the effectiveness of the program. And by talking about, you know, efficiency sometimes feels like a sort of a very unemotional way of looking at things, but with the more efficiencies we can get, the more people we can reach more quickly with fewer resources. So for us, efficiency, the more efficient we can get to a program, the more people are going to get reached across our business and elsewhere. And it's a kind of a, I guess, quite a business-based way of thinking about maximizing social value. And it's where our work with GBL becomes quite interesting, because what we do then is, within the programs that we implement, we start to look at kind of how do we roll out different methodologies, and is there a way that we can roll this program out in different ways to test its effectiveness? And I think like the work that we're starting to do with GBL around behavioral economics in terms of nudges, incentives, encouragements to take up services, I think that's where our kind of business brains are really going to start adding value to the world of development, because that's where we're going to start to almost, I think someone earlier mentioned A/B testing in terms of product development. We can almost do that within an ethical remit, but we can almost start to do that within development and see, okay, if we run it this way, how effective is it? If we run it this way, how effective is it? If we run it that way? And that, I think, just is a kind of ultimately a win-win for everyone involved. And then the third, if we move on to the kind of third lens that we look at, and this is crucial in its own way, but I don't want to sound like a mercenary, because I don't think it's, you know, ROI is not the first and foremost goal of doing these programs. But it's, what's really interesting is when, and again, GBL's work here has been like absolutely phenomenal, because it's a skill set we don't have to be able to measure this in the way that GBL does. But we kind of instinctively know through common sense and through business sense, like I said earlier, that a healthy, empowered workforce is going to be a better workforce, and it's going to make us a stronger business. When we can get into the nitty-gritty of demonstrating real financial ROI through randomized controlled trials, which are really the kind of gold standard research in that space, we are then able to kind of show, actually, it's not just like, well, we think this is good for business. With a program like PACE, which I won't get into the details of, but it's a brand-led brand-led empowerment program and soft skills program. With that, we're able to actually demonstrate, no, literally for every $1 we spend on this, $2.50 gets generated for the business. And as soon as we can, I may have mischaracterized that, Lavanya, so apologies if I have. But when we can demonstrate real return on investment, that means that we just have a remit then. We don't even have to sell it to the business, because we're like, well, this makes money, so this is like an easy win. And that means, I think also someone mentioned that we've been able to scale that program up to, I think it's about 34,000 workers so far, and we have a target to scale it up to 54,000 within the next few years. So that just, it means that we can scale things much more quickly, and then we can start talking to the rest of the industry and take a real leadership position on this, and say to our peers in the apparel sector and in other manufacturing sectors that these programs are not nice to have. We don't even think they're good for business. We know it, and we can prove it with real numbers. So that is a really, really powerful kind of new way of looking at the impact of development programs within the private sector. And I think we're pretty excited about how do we continue to do that and continue to kind of build that body of evidence around the work that we've done. So I think that's the kind of the basic context of why we think M&E is important and what kind of M&E we think is important. I don't know if we want to open it up to any questions, Nancy?
Yeah. So I'll actually quickly summarize
Great.
what you just said for everyone, and then we'll open it up to questions. Laura spoke about the scale of Shahi and how with this scale, it's important to be efficient in terms of programs and how there is a potential to drive change at this big scale. How Shahi looks at worker well-being, not just as philanthropy, which is why M&E is important to them. And then the three broad buckets that she outlined, Shahi looks at are social well-being, effective implementation, and business impact. We'll now open it up to questions. Same drill, guys, raise your hand, I'll call out. Or if somebody wants to post a question on the chat, that's also okay. Oh, I think Anna posted a question on the chat. Has Shahi stopped doing certain programs because the M&E did not demonstrate effectiveness?
Also, Lavanya, I think Avijit is raising his hand on the video.
Oh, okay.
Can I speak? Can you?
Yes. Yes.
I sort of had a quick question on this business impact side. Oftentimes, interventions are designed for behavioral changes. How do you sort of measure the financial ROI of a behavioral change? Practically, at a ground level.
So that's two questions. Laura, you can answer both of them.
Okay, so the first one, have we ever stopped a program? It's a really good question because, you know, there are also some, like you would imagine that if we're going to be doing this rigorous M&E that we would, and there are, you know, but there are also ethical questions of starting stuff and then just kind of dropping it. You know, you can't open up access to services and then be like, it's not really showing ROI, we'll stop. So I think what's probably more, I think the way I'd characterize it more is Shahi actually, you know, the scale of Shahi is absolutely immense, as you know. And we actually have, because of the relationship we have with brands, we have lots of different programs actually running across different factories at once. And I think what's, the way that we actually think about this is actually how do we optimize those programs? How do we change the things that aren't working and add in things that we think will work better? And also, how do we kind of up and down the levels of different programs in different factories, because some work better in some contexts and some work better in others. I think there are certainly some programs we could talk about, and some things that we did in hostels in particular, where after understanding the impact of program, we redesigned those programs. But I think our intention is to, rather than kind of drop a program, is to redesign it and retool it and make it fit for purpose. So that's really how we'd probably look at the kind of sort of negative outcomes of if we find any with M&E. Oh, sorry, there were two questions. Can you just repeat the second one? It was behavioral. How do we measure the ROI of behavioral change? Was that right, Lavanya?
Yes. Avijit, do you want to?
That's the question exactly.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer this, Lavanya, actually, because it's kind of a research-based question. I mean,
I was just wondering if you can give a practical understanding of it. Like, do you have any practical indicator you use?
Smit or I can help you with that.
Okay, so
Smit, do you want to take it?
Yeah, I think that would be really great.
We actually, as Smit mentioned, especially at Shahi, we have data systems, really accurate and detailed data systems. So, you know, daily productivity of each worker, even, you know, and definitely, you know, workers when work in a line setting, you know, like let's say in teams of 20, 30, 40 people. So, you know, Shahi like keeps track of the productivity of each team or each line, and even each individual worker. So because of that, it's possible to, you know, calculate the ROI. We can say, you know, especially when we're randomizing, you just compare two groups, right? One group gets an intervention, the other does not. Now you just look at the average productivity of the two groups, and it's very simple to do because of Shahi's data systems. And other businesses should have these in place, especially if they're large, and that's what allows us to do it. Otherwise, you would have to again invest along with the surveys, along with the welfare outcomes, you know, the softer outcomes. You would have to invest in measuring the productivity, which is also possible. We have a small project where in rural Karnataka we tried to you know, measure the productivity of women, and it's possible to do. It's definitely possible to do. You just, you know, look at the quality and quantity of things produced. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Sadish, for answering my question.
Great. I think this webinar is getting really interesting with great questions. So please save some for our next speaker for today, who is Roxanne O'Connell. She's a program manager at Humanity United, which is a foundation that is part of the Omidyar network. Humanity United is also dedicated to bringing new approaches to global problems that have been long considered intractable. Roxanne holds a master's in international affairs from Columbia University, and today she will talk to us about why it's crucial to invest in M&E as part of funding on-ground programs.
All right, thank you, Mansi, for the introduction and for the invitation to participate in this webinar. It's an honor and a pleasure to discuss our partnership with Good Business Labs and to give a bit of an overview of Humanity United itself. As mentioned, Humanity United is a foundation, and we are dedicated to bringing new approaches to global problems that have been long considered intractable. So we build, lead, and support efforts that change systems that contribute to problems like human trafficking, mass atrocities, and violent conflict. And we are a part of the Omidyar Group, which is a diverse collection of organizations, each guided by its own approach, but united by a common desire to catalyze social impact. So Humanity United, my organization's efforts, are focused around two priority areas. First is eradicating forced labor and human trafficking. And the second is to bring new approaches to peace building in areas of violent conflict. And so I sit within the forced labor and human trafficking program. And these issues, as mentioned by, I think, all of the speakers, these issues are complex and they require all actors to engage, including the private sector. It can't just sit within the public sector. And so, oh, I'm sorry, okay. The next slide. So as we were thinking through our strategy, a key tenet of this is to leverage the role and the responsibility that the private sector has to mitigate labor exploitation. And we believe that increasing private sector transparency and accountability will ultimately lead to reduced worker vulnerability to exploitation. Next slide. So as we work through that strategy, we also recognize that there were not necessarily a lot of tools or information that the private sector can use. So in 2017, we launched a program called the Sidecar Innovation Fund, which was generously supported by the UK's government, the Department for International Development. And the Sidecar was designed to do three things. Firstly, to support entrepreneurs to build, launch, and refine technology solutions that the private sector could integrate into their supply chains to provide them with more transparency. We provide entrepreneurs with support who are tackling issues around worker voice tools, risk assessment, ethical sourcing, product traceability, and responsible recruitment. Secondly, we hope to build a body of evidence-based research to support the market's education around those issues. So we've commissioned a handful of research papers that provide more information on the landscape of tools, best practices, and demonstrate the market size for these tools. Again, we've heard a lot about ROI and about kind of the business case of these interventions. So we found that necessary as well. And the third thing, lastly, we are hoping to build the field through a series of convenings similar to this one, where we raise awareness not only about challenges that workers face in supply chains, but also the emerging solutions that are backed by research and evidence. And all of that, we hope, will strengthen an ecosystem that enables the private sector to proactively integrate those solutions into their supply chains. So part of this work, obviously, as we've heard, revolves around rigorous monitoring and evaluation to determine if the tools are actually working. And so M&E is a crucial piece of the puzzle when we think about making investments as funder. We need to know what works and why. As I mentioned, worker voice is a focus area of ours. And because we believe that when workers have a platform to be heard, their conditions will inherently improve. And so a bit about our partnership with Good Business Labs, we are supporting the evaluation of the worker tool and not actually the worker tool itself, because we recognize the transformative impact that it could have on, well, over 100,000 workers, as we heard, if just implemented throughout Shahi's factories. But as we've heard also, Good Business Labs has now expanded in Latin America, which is very exciting. So the opportunities are potentially endless. So this tool has the opportunity to enable factories to mitigate issues that may arise on the factory floor while also empowering workers to have their voices heard. And while there is a lot of opportunity in the successful scaling of a worker voice platform, we also want to acknowledge the potential risks and who holds those risks. So this evaluation will help us measure that there are protections in place for the workers around issues like employee retribution or data privacy. And there was a lot of conversation earlier about ethical concerns, and so that's something that we take very seriously as well. In other words, this evaluation helps us understand if the tool is working in a way that benefits both the workers and the employees and the employers. This process, we think, will lead to a more effective worker voice tool and provide more market education that others who are working in this space will be able to see the value of an M&E process and learn from what Good Business Lab finds. So we're really delighted to be a part of conversations like this one and hope that we are able to continue to learn from one another. So thank you for inviting me here and open for questions.
Thanks, Roxanne. I think you gave us the line of the day. In a very simple term, you really summarized M&E, saying that it's important because it's important to know what works and why. And that's the simplest definition of M&E. I also caught these few lines from your PPT and realized that it is true that when responsibility meets opportunity, I think paradigm shifts can happen. And thank you for giving us the funder's perspective on this side of things. Since we have participants ready with questions, we'll open the floor for that. So if you can please raise your hands and ask any questions you may have for Roxanne. Yeah, I see 2 hands. Arvind, can you please ask your question?
Hi, Roxanne. Arvind here.
Hi, Arvind.
Hi. So we know that you are working with various organizations in the field of worker voice. So I wanted to understand the difference between various investments that you have made in this particular space and how the GBL organization has a strong M&E component in its most of the projects. So is this the case with the rest of the organizations that you are working with?
Perfect. Baba, can you please ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Hey, Roxanne. It was nice. Your presentation. It was nice to learn about the Sidecar Innovation Fund and the evaluation programs and the focus areas that Humanity United is currently focusing on. I just wanted to ask one thing. When are you talking about evaluation, the evaluation and scale up in general? How does foundation like Humanity United balance between the time taken for a complete evaluation and the scale up of that evaluation respectively? How do you balance between these two processes?
Yeah, I'll start with the first question about the different investments that we've made in regards to worker voice. So as I mentioned, we have a 3-pronged approach. So all of our investments and our grantees look very, very different. We try to be really thoughtful with how we partner with our grantees, recognizing that all of their needs are different and they're trying to approach different aspects of worker voice or worker empowerment tools. And not just tools, also, as I mentioned, market education as well. So in regards to our partnership with Good Business Labs, for example, I mentioned that we are supporting the evaluation of the tool and not the tool itself. So, you know, as expected, there's a strong prioritization to make sure that there is a rigorous M&E component on that. And Good Business Lab is a great partner because, as you've heard from their earlier participant panelists about the data and the ethics and all of that, they're very thoughtful of how they go about doing it, about how they look at metrics and how they integrate different interventions into the workshops, into the factories. So another example might be a worker engagement tool, which is called Vive, which is a job rating platform. It's similar to Yelp, which allows workers to rate their employers, so that future job seekers can make more informed decisions. So it's currently being piloted in Mexico, and it's getting good reviews, but it's quite small. So evaluation there looks a lot different. It's a lot smaller. It's more focused around a feedback loop of the people who are leaving their reviews through the platform, but there's also a lot more anonymity in a website like Vice, as opposed to Good Business Lab, where you might not have the same risks for data exposure and employer retribution, things like that. So I also wanted to highlight some of our non-technical assistance interventions. Part of our, as I mentioned, part of our market education activities, we've supported the development of worker engagement supported by technology principles, otherwise known as the WEST principles. And this outlines the best practices for technologists to follow when developing worker-facing tools. And those principles are broken down to 4 stages: the design, engaging with workers, analyzing, and utilizing data. So even through there, you can see the importance that we hold on data, and particularly from a worker-centered, worker-designed standpoint. So I hope that answers your question a bit.
Thanks, Roxanne.
And then the second question about the balance between M&E and scaling up evaluations, or just scaling up. As I mentioned, M&E is definitely a necessary component for all of our investments. What we don't want to see is a proliferation of solutions that are not designed with the worker in mind, and is not grounded in evidence, because without proper evaluation, these tools could have unintended consequences potentially. And we don't want to, we want to be very thoughtful about how we're supporting different tools and the effects that it has on workers. So that being said, we are very intentional with the partners that we're working with. We do a lot of due diligence on who we are working with, recognizing that grantees vary in size. Good Business Lab has a great backing with Shahi and integrated into Shahi Exports, but a company like Vice, who is much smaller, might not necessarily have the same institutional backing. So we have to be kind of cognizant of that. We need to meet the grantee where they are, especially since we work with such early stage entrepreneurs who might have a technical expertise in, in human rights, for example, or labor law, but might not necessarily have the M&E expertise. So we help them think through what good evaluation practices looks like. So success to us is not measured by scale. It's first and foremost, our consideration is measured and hinged on how the project, we believe, has the potential impact to further our goal to reduce workers' vulnerability to labor exploitation. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Roxanne, for beautifully addressing the questions. With that, we're done with all 4 speakers. Over to Lavanya for summarizing.
Great, thanks so much, everyone. We'll open the floor to questions now. It's the same drill as before. Just raise your hand and I'll call out to you. In case you don't want to talk, you can also send us a question on the chat and we'll read it out. You can address it to a specific panelist, or you can ask a general question and a panelist can choose to respond.
Also, please feel free to share any comments that you may have, or any ideas of your own pertaining to or related to the topic we discussed today.
Hey guys, there was one question to me from Afsar, which I'll just read out and try to answer. So I want to understand the approach of finding out the impact evaluation techniques when RCT is impossible. For example, working in CSR projects where the project is already at place and there is no way to do a baseline or pre-data. So that's a very interesting question, and a lot of time that is faced by a lot of M&E people, where they're roped in much later by either the program design is done or program is already on the ground. So in that setting, I think some cases it is not possible to do anything. And then you have to just maybe stick to some qualitative data or quantitative just measurement, or just the process data saying, identifying how well the program was taken, and try to triangulate your beliefs and quantify your findings, saying that this is what we did and this is what we found, but XYZs are limitations of our approach. And that's there. But some cases where you can still find, for example, few of the projects where we are trying to do is propensity score matching, where you try to find out similar population who have not received the program, and if they're comparable, try to use them and do an end line with them. And as some of, not, I wouldn't go into technicality of why we would need we would not need a baseline, but I think those approaches can work. But I think in general, my sense is in such cases, you try to do best as you can, and then provide what are the limitations of your approach. Because even if it's not an RCT, there is a lot of things that can be learned by good just measurement of approach, understanding how the process worked, what was the process, where was there any failure in your theory of change, and just monitoring most aspects of your theory of change and trying to measure them would also be very helpful in M&E. May not be an academically kind of rigorous evaluation which you can publish in journals, but at least for the funders or the CSR project, that can still add a lot of value.
Great, thanks so much for that. Varun is raising his hand, so go ahead, Varun, you can ask your question.
Yeah, hi. This question is for Laura. Given that the business are fast-moving environments, profit-oriented environments, how do we justify delays to program rollouts due to M&E?
Just put my video on. So just to summarize, I think the question was, how do we justify any delays to rolling out programs because of M&E, right? I think it's an interesting question. And, I think businesses are sometimes fast-moving environments and sometimes not, actually. Like, sometimes R&D schedules can be years and years and years ahead of time. And so I think what's really important, I think, for businesses, as I said before, is optimization and making sure that things work or are going to work before they get started. So I think in some ways, to have a plan to understand how you're going to measure whether something's working before you actually start it is actually kind of ultimately ingrained in the psyche of business. Quite often, obviously, from business perspective, we might be, well, are we selling more of it, or is it increasing productivity? And I think that, I don't think it's kind of a new idea to be measuring things, but I think it in some ways depends on the urgency of the program. There are some programs where I think, or some initiatives where it's just really urgent to get that program rolling. And in that case, I think as Smit just said, we might need to look at, maybe it's not an RCT, and maybe an RCT isn't the optimal research methodology for that particular program, but doesn't mean we can't measure it. We can always measure the outcome of something. But in others, I think trialing opportunities and making sure that things work. And as I said before, these are really important social outcomes, and particularly kind of things like labor rights. And if we get them wrong, it's not just about, oh, well, we might lose some money, but actually there can be really, really negative unintended consequences if you get things wrong when you're dealing with really important issues like this. So I think, it's always going to be a balance, but justifying the need to measure things, I think, is probably quite innate in the business mindset. So we haven't had too many problems with that, but every program is different, and we sort of figure out the optimal way of doing things as we go. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you.
Guys, we have 2 questions in the chat box. So one is from Anna, and the question is for the M&E expert. What is the current state of how programs align or not on M&E indicators? Would it be better if M&E KPIs were made more consistent for, let's say, health and wellness programs? I'll just take a stab at it. I think it's a very interesting question and suggestions. But so, for example, my understanding is limited, and maybe Laura and Roxanne can jump into this. But I do see M&E becoming a more as a part of kind of grants. So a lot of times M&E as kind of put into even the budgets people submit, or even the grant application people put forward, as just to understand how the program is going. So I think bare bones M&E instead of just making like, say, if you look at your theory of change, just the first part of how many people you're reaching, how many people actually got it, those kind of M&E indicators, I think have become very common in almost all the programs. Maybe not the more advanced ones, say how to do research design, whether you want to do some secondary outcomes, those are still far off. But most of the programs I do think have some form of M&E. And about bringing M&E into kind of a consistent KPI, I think most of it has. For example, if you look at, say, early childhood programs, the stunting, wasting, as well as malnutrition, and some of the other indicators have become very, like, if you look at most of the development program in that sector, they would have become very standard. Some sectors like wellness programs, I don't think there are that many coherence there. But then I think it's just some type things are, for example, health. WHO has done a great work, has been a coordinating agency for a lot of programs, and that seeps into the entire community who is working on those areas. For wellness, I'm not sure. We use some sort of indicators which are standard in academic communities, which are used, but they're not used, say, by other practitioners. So there is no consistency or like a kind of mutual understanding across community of using some indicators. So I think the programs become saturated, people gravitate towards some understood KPIs. And of course, there will be a lot of difference depending on the programs, but I think a lot of cases, especially in health interventions, people are becoming more consistent in measuring similar outcomes. In wellness program, we are, I think, a bit off.
Thanks, Smith, for addressing that. We also have a very interesting question from Shilpi, which is up for grabs, but perhaps Sadish, you might want to address it. She asks, has GBL worked with or considered any other industries, and what are the benchmarks that you might need to consider when picking an industry? Yeah, and you turn your video on, so that's great.
Sure. I can start off, and I think others can join in also. We would love to work in other industries. I think the bottom line of GBL is to reach as many workers as possible and to generate evidence, in whatever industry possible, and then create change, right? So the apparel industry has a really large workforce. The service industry, if you think about, like the gig economy, where people are just joining in without a very formal, without a brick and mortar sort of organization present, there's a very large population that is involved in the gig economy. So that could be very interesting if we can do that. A lot of the service industry, some of our conversations in Latin America look very promising. If we could do things with McDonald's or Toyota, who have really large employer bases. So we are very much open to it. I think, I think that's really it. I mean, we'd have to sit down and figure it out. A lot of times, if we're talking about evaluation, it is, we do have to think about what exactly we want to measure, how we want to measure it. And to do it right, we do need to work with a large enough of a sample size. So the organization or the industry would need to have a large enough of a worker base. But so those are my thoughts on that. If somebody else has any other thoughts, please share.
Would any of the other panelists like to add, or there is a question specifically for Laura from Mamta? Do you think there has been a change in the appetite of business leaders for M&E in the last decade?
Hi, thanks for that question. Just before I get onto that, I wanted to just, we talked a little bit earlier, and I think it was Smit who was talking a bit about benchmarking on kind of the same parameters across, like choosing benchmarking parameters. And I think benchmarking is something that we're now really starting to look at, because we've got so many different things happening across multiple factories, and we're measuring the outcomes of each program individually. But I think what we've started to think about now is, what are those benchmarks? How do we know if we're improving as a business, and how do we benchmark ourselves against other organizations? And there is some really fantastic work happening. Roxanne I would imagine, would be able to add a bit to this as well. But we met like just this week actually with the World Benchmarking Alliance, who certainly for businesses are looking at what does what are adequate gender benchmarks? What does gender equality look like in business, and how do we make sure that we have a gender lens to all the programs that we do and that we're improving? Similarly for human rights, how do we look at human rights in business and make sure that all the individual programs, training, awareness, and worker voice tools are actually adding up to improve human rights in a business? So I actually think that benchmarking and finding those points across all companies that are consistent is really, really interesting and important. I think it'll become more important as we move forward very quickly. Just to tackle this second question, has there been a change in the appetite of business leaders for M&E in the last decade? I think yes, definitely, in terms of there's been an increase in the importance of impact-driven programs. So yes, just to kind of talk briefly, I've worked in India I did work in India for about 8 years, and in my kind of role there as a CSR consultant, I think what we saw there that was really, really interesting, and I think it's kind of an example of kind of macro change that's happened, because it happened in India so quickly that I'm sure everyone's aware of the kind of the CSR law, the 2% donation of profits. So what happened was the kind of companies went from looking at CSR as philanthropy to it becoming part of the legal framework of business in India. And simultaneously, the amount of money that people had to spend went up quite significantly. So you had companies who were kind of doing nice things and they had a sort of philanthropic endeavor going on. And suddenly, not only was it kind of being discussed as part of a legal mandatory, but also the amount of money getting spent on it was huge. And that was really important, because part of the law in India demands that the company has a committee that includes board members, and that the board signs off on all CSR expenditure and reporting. So suddenly you've got these kind of really smart business people who've perhaps never really taken any notice of or too much notice of the philanthropic CSR bit that's happening, although they know it's there. Suddenly this is on their desk, it's in the boardroom, and they're going, hang on a minute, how much money are we spending on this? And what are we getting back from it? Like, what's happening as a result? Are we talking about this? And their business brains kick in, like from an optimization perspective. And I've certainly seen in my experience just over the last, I guess at least since that came in from 2014 in India, but I think that's probably over the last like 20 years, companies are starting to see, well, if we're really investing in this, and more importantly, if we're going to be talking about it publicly and using it as a reputation driving initiative as well, we have to be really rigorous, and we have to know that what we're doing is not fluff, that it's actually impactful, and that it's driving real impact that we can be really proud of. So yes, I think it will, as it becomes more and more integrated into the kind of bones of business, M&E will become absolutely critical, just as it is in other business functions. Thanks,
Laura. We have a parade of questions on the chat window. I have one more from Harijat.
Can I just jump in with the benchmarks? Sorry, I wanted to follow up on Laura's comments.
Yes.
I just wanted to follow up. Laura had mentioned about the benchmarks, and I also wanted to draw some attention to the chain benchmarks, which is something that started in 2016, and it's essentially a benchmark across different industries. This past year in 2018, we did 3 different benchmarks across food and beverage, apparel and footwear, and ICT. So if you go to knowthechain.org, you'll be able to find kind of the different companies that were benchmarked. We had 40 in ICT, 38 in food and beverage, 43 in apparel and footwear. And we look at different areas, including worker voice, which, as I mentioned, is a common theme for us and a focus area. But then we also look at things like commitment. How committed is a particular business to disclosing and addressing forced labor conditions within their supply chain. And then we also look at things like recruitment and responsible recruitment. Are workers paying to be in those positions? Are they being exploited throughout the process of recruitment? So I did the topic of benchmarking, I wanted to draw the attention to that because we do have some standard indicators that we have for those industries, and they are, they're not perfect. And I think as indicators, they're kind of always evolving depending on the situation, depending on how things evolve over time and what the pressing need is. But this, our first set was released in 2016 and now most recently in 2018. So please take a look at that if that's a useful resource for you.
Perfect, thank you. If anyone wants to jump in at any point to respond to a certain comment or make a new one, please feel free. Moving on, Parijat has a question which is up for grabs. Perhaps Smith would like to answer this. He or she asks, has there been any attempts to replicate the studies carried out at Shahi under different scenarios? Factories not a part of Shahi or even in other developing countries?
Yeah, so I think the short answer is no. We haven't replicated our studies somewhere. So I think you're speaking to a larger concern in developing or economics in general, where people are trying to replicate studies and trying to see if these effects stand. So we would like to replicate some of studies. So our scale-up approach is not to do the similar RCTs because this requires a lot of resources. Maybe if you have someday a lot of resources, we would like to replicate the same study. But at this moment, our focus is on trying to get new research out and then try to scale it up in different settings and then do light touch M&E to actually see if the effects stand in the similar way. So we would like to do some M&E for the programs that we have tested, but at this moment, we don't have any, at least in the near future, plan to essentially replicate some of the studies.
Thanks, Smith. Okay, we have one interesting question. Bhavya asks, rather comments that there's probably, okay, I don't need to read that out. So she asks that does GBL consider automation a challenge at all when trying to convince businesses to invest in worker wellness? Given that automation does threaten government workers since it's factory labor and in general affects the labor cost advantage of developing countries. Perhaps Laura can take this one, and maybe Bhavya, if you can explain your question a little more, that would be helpful.
Yeah, that's pretty much about it. Since a lot of, GBL's work is based on trying to, prove with numbers that it's better and more profitable to invest in worker wellness. It's more efficient to do that. But how do you reconcile that with, let's say, how do you reconcile that with automation, which obviously sort of threatens to trump workers and any type of productivity increase that they can, offer to firms? This is, again, like I said, it's maybe a little far-fetched to sort of, have this as a consideration, but yeah. Is it one, or can it become one, or how do you plan to address it?
I think you bring up a really, I think we've got two questions though, really. Kind of, I think automation is going to affect business and how that's going to affect labor is kind of one big topic of which I'm not an expert, but we know it's coming and we know it's going to happen. And there's a lot of talk and a lot of reports around the future of that. I think McKinsey actually just released a report this week on the potential impacts of I think it's on automation and AI on workforces. I'm not quite sure actually. Might be on the future of workforces, but it's out this week, I'm sure. So I think like how that's going to affect workers is certainly a question. But I think like the work of kind of M&E and the work of GBL is really kind of looking at the workforce that exists. And I think that, as I said earlier, for those workers who are still going to be employed, whether automation impacts or not, the numbers of those workers, I don't think we'd ever take a stand where we, and I don't think any other manufacturer would say, well, it's not really worth investing in people anymore because they're all going to be redundant soon. We are always going to have some people, and the people who are there are critical resources for the business, and we need to optimize those resources as much as possible. So I think like that question of automation is going to become huge for all manufacturing companies at some point in the future. But I don't think it necessarily undermines the need to invest in upskilling and supporting and protecting the rights of the workers that we already have and will retain into the future. I don't know if anyone from GBL has found that there's a challenge or a conflict between kind of the oncoming automation of jobs or not in your work.
I would like to quickly talk about this, because this is a question that I asked myself, and I have no idea actually. But this is what I think. I think from the GBL's point of view, you mentioned automation in maybe the apparel sector, but we are not. This is our sort of home base in a sense, but we're not tied to the apparel sector. And even within the apparel sector, it's not going to happen anytime soon. Even if like it's 5 years, 10 years down the line, that still gives us plenty of opportunity to do a lot of good work. And as Laura was also saying, a lot of our current interest is also to do with like soft skills. And even if the bottom line, the very basic processes get automated, you still have to think about managers and people who oversee the processes, and like so this soft skills components or like health components are still there. So I don't think we'll be totally out of business. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much for that. I think we will stop there because we're over time. Yeah, thanks so much everyone for joining, all our panelists, everyone from Good Business Lab, and the other organizations that you've all represented. It's definitely been a thought-provoking and stimulating session for all of us. Yeah, thanks guys.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.